Hello, my name is Nathan Swift. I am a security cloud solution architect here at Microsoft. Happy to be here today to be talking about security automation part 2. We're going to be talking about triggers and how to use those in our design as we're building out a sample security automation. Let's dive right into it. So when we talk about security automation in our previous video, we were talking about building one out for Azure Defender. But before we jump right into that, I want to talk specifically about the triggers and the types of triggers you can use when building your security automation. There's any kind of number of triggers, and so we'll break them down to begin with some generic triggers. So when I mean by generic triggers, I mean they're not the way that these automations can be executed are kind of in two patterns. A timer, so it's a scheduled type of job that runs independent of whether you're using Azure Sentinel or Azure Defender or Security Center, or a webhook, a request. And again, that's independent of whether you use Azure Sentinel or Security Center or Azure Defender. And to give you a quick example of what those might look like, I'm going to go ahead and open up Logic App Designer here. And so when we go to build those type of triggers that might be generic, we'll go ahead and we'll start with a blank Logic app. And if we start looking for the triggers here, we start searching for, let's do schedule. We'll find a scheduled trigger that we can reoccur on a daily, weekly, hourly, or even monthly basis. And so think of that as a pattern, right? If we're building a security automation, maybe it's a generation of a report. We go out monthly and look for all of our disabled Active Directory accounts or disabled employees out in Workday or somewhere. And we need that generation of that report to occur monthly, right? Or maybe weekly. That's kind of the timer pattern that we can use as a generic trigger here. Beyond that, we can also use another type of generic trigger when we're building our security automations, and that's going to be in the form of HTTP requests or webhooks. And so with that, when a request is received via the Logic app over a webhook, we'll go ahead and take that request in the JSON body, and we can then do additional stuff off of that data coming in there. When we go to use this, we'll get a full URL that can be used to make post calls to the Logic app once we hit the save button with a HTTP request trigger. To give you a quick example of what those patterns might look like, in this one, we're looking at one called Auto Connect Azure Security Center subscriptions. This is a playbook that's out there for Azure Sentinel. And the idea behind that is in a timer approach, we're going to ensure that any new Azure subscriptions that have been created, for instance, within the last day, we're going to go ahead and update those subscriptions. And for each new subscription, we're going to update Azure Sentinel's Azure Defender data connector so that it includes those Azure Defender alerts from the new subscription. And we're going to also update bidirectional syncing as well between Azure Sentinel and Azure Defender. Again, these are for net new subscriptions that were created within the last 24 hours that Azure Sentinel may not be aware of since it was a new subscription created. The other approach that we just talked about was the URL or webhook approach. And so in this instance, we're looking at ingestion of canary tokens. And you can see here it's saved out. We've got a nice URL that can be posted to from a canary token that's opened in Microsoft Word or in a SQL database or a DNS query, for instance. And once that canary token's open, it will invoke this URL with a post call with some data to it. And we'll see here that invoke call is wrapped up with a signature and that signature can be reset or recycled if needed via some properties of the logic app. But this is a very unique URL. We'll talk later in another session about how to secure logic apps, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But those are kind of the two generic triggers that are available. Now, we're going to pivot from these generic triggers that we just looked at and talk a little bit about Azure Sentinel triggers next. So Azure Sentinel triggers, you'll notice that if we go into Logic Apps again, and we go to create a Azure Sentinel trigger here, we'll see that there are two types of triggers today. As of this recording on October 22nd, there is a Azure Sentinel alert trigger and an Azure Sentinel incident creation rule was triggered. Now, why are there these two triggers, and how might I use these different triggers? When Azure Sentinel was first created back and launched back in 2019, it came with an orchestration automation concept called alerting off, triggering and doing automation off of the security alerts themselves rather than the security incidents. And we'll show this in just a second. So what's happening now is there's an ongoing effort in the Azure Sentinel GitHub to combine and consolidate these two different triggers. And the best example of that effort is if we go to VirusTotal's IP report, for instance, we'll see that there's now in the playbooks alert triggers and incident triggers specifically designed following the same kind of automation path. Now, why are there these two different alert trigger, incident trigger? Well, let's go back to Azure Sentinel and quickly look at that. So the idea here is within Azure Sentinel has these playbooks that can be manually ran, for instance, by security analysts. So they may not be necessarily full-blown security automations. They're still doing automation pieces and orchestration pieces. They're just not being automatically triggered by an incident creation. Instead, they can be triggered via security alert or manually. So, for instance, if I go into a security incident here that's coming up, and when the security incident comes up here, I can go ahead and click on one of the security incidents that I have, and I can see that I might need to run some, during the course of my investigation, might need to run some automation or orchestration. And in order to do that, while I'm working in here, I can go ahead and click on the View Playbooks. Now within here, I can go ahead and execute a playbook, but I'm specifically executing playbooks that have an alert trigger to them, not an incident trigger. And so in that playbook that I could execute for VirusTotal in this case, it will go out and now that I've manually done it, put some comments in here about VirusTotal's IP report, telling me that the reputation is 12 for this public IP address found in the security incident, and that most likely indicates it's harmless. In addition, it's writing a KQL query that I could use later to look up some additional information that may not be in here. And so that's the alert. The other idea with that too is you can automate alerts to trigger those playbooks automatically using that alert trigger. And so if we go into an existing rule or we go to create a new rule, one of the things we'll see in the wizard is an area for automation. And so if I click on automated responses here, I could select an existing alert trigger to then be automatically ran whenever a alert was generated, or an incident was generated in Azure Sentinel. Now, there are these new concepts, or there's a new trigger called Sentinel Incident, like we were just seeing here. And so an incident trigger is a little bit different. It's used so that the playbook can be executed against an automation rule. So about less than a year ago or so, Azure Sentinel launched with some additional capabilities around orchestration automation, things called automation rules. And the concept there was, rather than having to update each alert rule automation and execute a single playbook that's automating that, the idea was to kind of create an automation, a set of rules with priorities that would execute based off conditions outside of that actual detection rule itself. And so if we go back into Azure Sentinel here, and we go into automation rules, we'll see that we can do this by using an automation rule instead. And this allows us to do things like, for instance, catch all of my security detections. And when I catch all of my security detections, I can go ahead and send an email regardless of the detection without having to assign a playbook to each security type of alert that I've set up. And so if I click in here and click edit, I'll see quickly that anytime I have any type of rule, or maybe specific sets of rules, and the severity of that incident is medium or high, and it's on a new detection or a new incident, go ahead and execute this playbook. Send an email with a formatted incident response. What that would look like then is when it executes, I get a nice little email for medium and high security incidents occurring in Azure Sentinel with some, formatted nicely with some information about what the alert was, the entities involved, the creation time, and a link to click to go back to that specific security incident. We'll let authentication do its thing, and then from that email, I was able to go directly into that security incident. There's incident IZ 621, and as the Azure portal's coming up, there we go. So to quickly recap, Azure Sentinel triggers, there are two types of triggers in Azure Sentinel. One is to alert off of the Sentinel alerts, and it's more of an old school, what I might call kind of legacy trigger. It's used primarily for manual execution as a playbook, but can also be used to automate through analytics rules, as we just recently saw. The newer method now is to create triggers that go through the automation rules instead, and can do data enrichment or send notifications via email like we were just seeing, or open up a Jira ticket or a ticket in ServiceNow. Those newer triggers basically use a Sentinel incident creation rule. And so that's the difference between those two. And again, we did talk a little bit earlier about the generic triggers out there. So last but not least, I want to talk about the Azure Defender triggers, or Azure Security Center triggers. And there are 3 out there. They're a little bit normal in the sense that if an alert in Azure Defender has been created, or if a security recommendation like posture management, a key vault does not have soft delete enabled, right? That might be a security measure you might want to turn on to prevent the deletion of keys or secrets or certificates to be hard deleted and unrecoverable. You may want to turn soft delete on your key vault for that. In addition to that, the third and final trigger is Azure Security Center compliance assessments. So maybe you need to trigger off of a particular NIST recommendation or a particular PCI DSS recommendation in your posture. and it's more compliance driven for your audit team, internal audit team or external auditors. And so you may create kind of an automation via that way. So let's jump back into the Azure here, and let's just quickly look at one of those connectors here. And we're looking at a security recommendation connector. And so it's triggered via Azure Security Center recommendation. And you'll notice that anytime these triggers occur, we get a nice little run history of information that can be found on the execution of that. And so one of the specific things I want to focus on here when we start developing security automation using logic apps is getting comfortable with knowing what that raw data being sent to us is. So in this case, I'm looking at a Security Center recommendation's been triggered. I get some outputs out of that Security Center recommendation. Particularly, it was vulnerabilities in the security configuration on my virtual machine should be remediated. I get some additional nice properties with that and some other information about how to remediate, a link directly to that security recommendation as well, specific to that virtual machine. Now, what I like to do is I immediately, when I start kind of developing this, is I immediately kind of pivot to the show raw outputs. I do this throughout the actions and also the triggers themselves, so I know what type of data I'm working with. In this case, what I'm specifically looking at is the body area of the Security Center recommendation. And I get some nice things like the Azure Resource or Security Recommendation ID. That's fully there. I get some details around the Azure Resource, in this case, virtual machine called VMPX, that has these security recommendations in it. And I get some nice metadata around that as well. And then finally, some links to the Azure portal that can be used to send in an email so someone could click on it like we were just seeing with Azure Sentinel. Now I'm going to go back here and we're going to develop our first Azure kind of Defender playbook. So if you recall from our last session, we had defined a problem statement of us wanting to notify a security team of high or medium Azure Defender alerts. But we also wanted to notify folks that had recently modified or created that Azure resource where a security incident was involved or a security alert was raised by Azure Defender. And so based off of that, we know that we're going to have to use a trigger for an Azure Defender alert. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and create a logic app here in the Azure portal. And we will search for logic app and be taken to the logic app wizard here. And logic apps are very powerful, low code, no code serverless solutions. One of those things to be aware of is they can be executed in different environments even. So for us, as we're building this logic app and the security automation, we're going to actually use consumption. So consumption is you're purchasing or you're being billed by execution, the number of actions and the trigger involved in that security automation. And they are micro pennies on those actions. Even when you're for each looping across maybe 100 entities or 100 rows of data, for instance, and doing things with that data, it still comes out to just fractions of pennies on the dollar for cost. Now, there are other instance models for Logic App where we need to put it in basically a app service plan. So we need dedicated compute and memory for this Logic App because it's very heavy or compute or memory intensive with what we're doing. Or we need to wrap it in a way so that it can be executed in a private virtual network in Azure. So we might need to create a security automation that can reach out across your private IP address spacing reach back on-prem or in your data center to invoke a API that's running in a data center somewhere, right, with an XML response. Or maybe we need to go out and reach over private IP address spacing, whether it's in Azure or in your data center again. And so that's where you might create that logic app within a standard plan so that it can be created inside a private virtual network. Yeah, last but not least, there's even an option for Docker container. So this is also some exciting things that you can do with security automation that we'll explore in later sessions. But we can create that logic app or that security automation to be instantiated anywhere, right? So think of like IoT devices, or Kubernetes might be running outside on-prem in a Kubernetes environment, maybe AWS or GCP. You need this security automation you're building to be executed in EKS or GKS, or you just need it to be able to run on a Raspberry Pi or somewhere else that's out there in the wild on the internet with a public IP address, but it's not really part of your Azure cloud, if you will, right? So that's really exciting to think about, being able to containerize a logic app and the automation you want to do, and then put that out on a factory floor somewhere potentially. So again, we're going to choose workflow and we're going to choose consumption. And we'll go ahead and deploy this in the East US region. And last but not least, we have to give this logic app a name. And so we are building kind of a notification security automation around Azure Defender alerts. So if I go back to the Azure Security Center GitHub repo, and I go into the workflow automation, and we'll see that the naming convention for both security automations, whether it's in Azure Sentinel or in Azure Defender Security Center, they kind of follow almost a PowerShell model, right? A verb-noun. Now, that's not all security automations follow that path, but most of them do. It's a quick way to look for things like notify, or verbs like isolate, or things that you may need to do like emails, right, on a noun perspective. And so what we're specifically looking for is we want to notify an Azure Defender alert or notify an ASC alert, but we want to do it by the Azure activity. So if we look at this guy here that was created to notify Azure Security Center recommendations and posture management by Azure activity, we can use that very similar nomenclature. Instead of a recommendation, we can say an alert. And so we'll say notify an ASC alert by Azure activity. And because we have this marketing concept here, it's now called Azure Defender, we'll change this a little bit. We'll say Azure Defender alert. And let's just double check again to see how we were saying it. Yep, AZ Defender alert. So again, when possible, it's good to maybe shrink some of the name. So we'll say notify AZ Defender alert by the Azure activity now. So I'm going to go ahead and go next. There's really no tags that we need to create right now. So I'm going to go ahead and create this logic app here. Now, when you go to create logic apps, just like storage accounts in Azure, they are super fast to be instantiated and created in the Azure management plane. So I can go to the resource here. And to help us out, it's going to automatically send me to the designer. And I'm going to go ahead and create a blank logic app. And I'm going to go ahead and use the Azure Security Center alert trigger. So we'll give it just a moment. There we go. Triggers when an Azure Security Center alert is created or triggered. So I'm going to choose that. It's going to quickly authenticate my account. And with that authentication, there'll be no additional steps that we need to do. So I'm just going to quickly save this guy here. And so that I don't lose my space, I'm going to actually pin him to the dashboard, the Azure dashboard that I'm doing here. And so I've got a nice Azure Defender alert. I'm going to move him over into this column of Azure Security Center logic app triggers. We go ahead and save this. And now I've got this pinned to my dashboard, so if I need to quickly pivot. So just a kind of a tip here when working with logic apps, I'm going to go ahead and go into Security Center. And as I'm building out the security automation, I'm just going to trigger and get some data in there so that I know what start looking at that raw output data like we were looking at earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and just go to my security alerts area of Security Center. And you can see here I've got a bunch of stuff, digital currency mining related, ransomware behavior detected, even potential malware uploaded to a blob storage account. So I'm going to go ahead and use this one here, the latest one that we're seeing here. And I'm going to go ahead and click Take Action. And with that, it's going to take me into an area where I can manually trigger a playbook against any of the Azure Defender alerts that we're looking here. So I'm going to trigger a logic app. And it's going to look out there and load the logic apps that are available. Now, it's going to see that it's going to filter them based off the Security Center alerts. Again, this is why those triggers matter, right? In different views, whether you're in Azure Sentinel and automation rules, or Azure Sentinel to run a playbook manually, or in a Azure Defender workflow automation or Azure Defender trigger a logic app like we're seeing here, those triggers will be filtered so that you're not seeing all the different logic apps out there that you have. So we just created one called Notify Azure Defender Alert by Azure Activity. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the trigger, check that, and then trigger this logic app. Now, if you're following along and you don't have any Azure Defender alerts right now, no worries, and you're trying to build one specifically for Azure Security Center, or in this case, Azure Defender, you can always create sample alerts in Azure Defender. So in Azure Security Center, when you go to Security Alerts, there's always a nice little button here called Sample Alerts. And maybe you want to develop a particular security automation based off DNS-based alerts. So we're going to create some sample DNS alerts here. And in just a moment, if you don't have any alerts, you'll now have some sample alerts you can then trigger and send some example data to, without you having to create some type of security incident or alert like in your actual environment. I love the fact that they've added sample alerts here. Usually just takes a few moments to create, and once it's created, you'll get a nice little alert here, and it will even tell in the alert title that it's a sample. So you see like parentheses sample and then the name of the alert, and then you'll get some details around that kind of sample alert. So while that sample alert is being created, we'll just pivot back to here. Whoop, there we go. It just got created. So we'll just quickly show what that looks like here. And we're back in security alerts. And we'll go by, filter quickly by the date time. And there we go. We can see some sample alerts based off a sample VM, but it's around DNS. So we can get some information around possible data exfiltration via DNS tunneling, and we can go into view full details, and we'll have a nice sample entity and data that we can then trigger, right, by taking action and triggering that logic app. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to choose that logic app again. And in this case, we're going to trigger the new one that we're creating and hit trigger here. All right, so now we've got some data sent to the logic app we're creating here. So we're going to go back in, and just a little tip here. This is how I kind of start working between two different screens when you're going to build your logic app. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my logic app here. And in our overview, in our run history, we should have at least 2 runs. There we go. One from the alert and then one from the DNS sample alert. And so what I end up doing is I always kind of duplicate my tab here. And I leave one tab open for the raw data, the historical data. And I use the other tab for the editor. And this way I'm not having to go back and forth and remembering which fields or how the data was structured as I'm building that out. And I'll show this in just a minute here as the Azure portal loads. And I'm going to go into designer mode in this second tab here. And so there we are when an Azure Security Center alert is triggered. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this action and the trigger. And I'm going to click on the first alert, and I'm going to click on the show raw outputs. All right, so I am in a designer mode, and I'm also in the raw outputs mode. And what this allows me to do, if we think about this, is maybe my next step is creating a variable for the resource name. So for instance, I'm going to initialize a variable, and it's going to be resource name, and it's going to be a string of data, and the output of which is going to be the resource name. So in this case, if we look at the different body of data on this trigger, we can get some really useful information. One of those things are going to be entities. Again, entities can be used for data enrichment or orchestrating or automating a response or something in the Azure management plane based off of that. Maybe it's just restarting the VM, let's say, for instance. Well, in order to restart the VM, I might need to pass in a call, like a put call or a post call to the Azure management API for the VMs. And I might need to supply it with either maybe the full Azure resource ID, but in this case, we might want to say something like the virtual name that's going to be restarted, just as an example. So you'll see here, if I just do a Control F through the body and I look for that virtual name throughout there, chances are, in this case, it's good because under extended properties, I have a compromised host, and there's the VM name in Azure, or really the OS host name, which is also the Azure virtual name. Maybe they're different though, right? And so maybe I can't count on the entity being the first entity in the array of data here at index 0. And maybe I just need to get the virtual name through this resource ID string, for instance. So what I'm going to do in this variable and being able to trigger back and forth is, if you recall in the last video, we talked about a wonderful blog by a gentleman named George Wilburn around Azure Security Center. So I'm just going to search for it out here. He had documented a really wonderful way to get some data out there, working with logic app parameters while building Azure logic apps. And so as soon as this guy loads here, we'll go ahead and take what we call expression out for our first step here. So this article here that George Wilburn had written, actually, while I was thinking of using this expression, first skip and split on the 8th thing here, This is primarily used for Azure Security Center recommendations. Since we're doing alerts, it's going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to pop back into our designer over here. And I'm going to go ahead and add an action beforehand. Again, our goal is to get the virtual machine name in Azure, not necessarily the host name, because the host name in the OS might be different from the Azure construct here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use basically a filter array. And the reason why I'm saying we're going to use a filter array is if we look under the alert, under entities, anytime in Azure Sentinel or in Azure Defender alerts, they'll have entities, but they'll always be listed in an array in declarative JSON that just looks like brackets, and it will contain JSON objects of the different entity information that was captured in the alert. And so in this case, I'm going to do filter array as my next option. And it's under the data operations actions, and there's my filter array. And so I'm going to filter on those entities, and you'll see here under dynamic content, many of the fields, like entities, alert display name, they'll be under this dynamic content. There's alert display name. Now, there may be instances where they don't show up under dynamic content, and so you might have to do something like trigger body and then name the particular field that you're trying to get. In this case, it might be compromised entity or maybe remediation steps, or maybe the status of the alert. So in this case, we are going to choose entities, and we're going to choose an entity item and contains. And what we're going to say is I want to filter on the field. Primarily, I want to look for Azure ID. I want the entity that has an Azure ID in it. So I'm going to go ahead and just post that guy in here. And then I'm going to save this guy here. And then back in the Logic App run, I'll resubmit, refresh, and then check out the filter array. There we go. So now we've got our step here in our filter array. We've filtered out, and again, I'm going to use show raw outputs. There's the individual entity. So the entity that I've called out specifically is, had a field called Azure ID, and it's always going to be at index 0 unless there were multiple Azure resources involved and multiple Azure VMs involved with the security incident. And what was interesting too about going back and looking at this trigger data under the show raw output is this concept of a compromised entity. So I really probably didn't need to filter an array, but really the idea here is just to get you kind of comfortable with going back and forth with the data you might be manipulating with the designer mode, so that you're not saving and then exiting back and reloading the history. It's just a time saver tip here. In our case, what I'm going to leave us with is I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy. I'm actually going to delete this guy as well too. Save him out one more time, and quickly just recap. So in our next session, we are going to look at building out the actions beyond the trigger. We're going to be looking up the activity logs. We're going to be using that filter array option again to filter those logs based off certain people that had created or updated the compromised entity. And then grabbing the email addresses and putting those into a to field or a variable that we'll eventually send to as an email address. So just to quickly recap, right, we spent a lot of time talking about triggers. We specifically spent some time talking about Azure Sentinel triggers, whether an Azure Sentinel alert is triggered because you want to manually execute something as a security analyst, or you want to just pair it with a specific alert detection or an analytic rule you created, or the concept of the trigger for Sentinel incidents when you want to use automation rules with priorities and certain conditional things that are outside of the actual analytic rule itself. We did talk about the different types of Security Center and Azure Defender triggers, and also, again, just generic triggers. There's a lot of security playbooks that are out there around generic triggers. Very helpful and very useful. So I hope you've learned something here today. I did myself, playing around a little bit with the filter arrays and looking at George's split skip kind of expression. In a later session, we'll talk more about those expressions. They're very powerful ways to go from no code into a low code area where you need to kind of manipulate the data or do some things on the data, replace some values in a string or some stuff in an array, or just kind of find something through an expression. So again, just happy to be here, happy to kind of talk about triggers. Hope you have a wonderful day. And again, feel free to leave comments or any questions. You can reach out to me at SwiftSolves via Twitter, or check out some of the other information that I have in the YouTube channel to reach out and contact me. Thank you and have a wonderful day.